The wind came down from the north like a blade, sharp and without mercy. It drove the snow sideways, piling drifts against the trunks of the lodgepole pines and scouring the ridges clean. For 3 days, the world had been reduced to the howl of the wind and the suffocating white of the storm. Eli Mercer felt the cold deep in his bones, a familiar ache that had long since replaced loneliness. He pulled the wolf fur collar of his coat tighter, his beard stiff with ice. This was trapping weather. The animals would be hunkered down, but the ones foolish enough to move would be desperate, and desperation made them careless. He moved through the trees with a silence that seemed impossible for a man his size. He was built like the mountain itself, broad, rugged, and worn smooth in some places, jagged in others. His life was a map of hard lines, etched around his eyes and mouth, stark against the weathered leather of his skin. He checked the first trap, empty. The second, also empty, the bait frozen solid. He reset it with numb fingers, his movements economical, wasting nothing. He had lived alone in this high, unforgiving valley in the Montana territories for 6 years. He had come seeking silence, and the mountain had given it to him in abundance. The silence was a balm, but it was also a burden. He was turning back toward the creek line when he saw it. He stopped, his body going utterly still. His eyes narrowed against the stinging snow. Boot prints. They were not his. They were small, the treads shallow and erratic, half filled by the driving snow. No man he knew made a print that small. They were fresh, an hour old, maybe 2. His hand went to the skinning knife on his hip, a gesture as unconscious as breathing. He did not like trespassers. The land was free, but this patch was his, earned through winters that would kill lesser men. He followed the tracks, his rifle now cradled in his arm. They staggered, moving without purpose, heading toward the creek bed where the ice would be thin. A fool's path. The prints led down a shallow embankment, ending in a dark patch of churned snow near the water's edge. It was not an animal. It was a person, or what was left of one. A heap of dark, wet rags indistinguishable from the frozen mud, save for the faint wisp of breath that plumed in the air. Eli stood on the bank for a full minute, the wind ripping at him. He looked at the sky, then at the bundle. Trouble. It was nothing but trouble. His solitude was a fortress, and this was an invasion. He had spent years burying the man he used to be, the man who got involved, the man who cared. He cursed, the sound snatched away by the wind. He could leave it. The cold would finish the job by nightfall. It would be a mercy. But he was already moving, sliding down the bank, his boots sinking into the slush. He turned the body over. It was a woman. Her face was blue-white, her hair frozen in icy tangles to the ground. A dark stain matted the side of her head, the blood frozen black against her pale skin. She was young, or had been. It was hard to tell. He hesitated. He had been alone too long. The simple act of touching another person felt foreign, dangerous. He could feel the fragile bit of peace he had carved for himself beginning to crack. He sighed, a deep, weary sound. He knelt, slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her, her head lolling against his chest, and began the long, hard climb back to his cabin. The cabin was one room, built of thick-set logs and chinked with mud and moss. It smelled of pine smoke, cured hides, and coffee. He laid her on his own cot, the only one he had, and piled dry furs on top of her. He worked with grim efficiency. He stirred the fire in the stone hearth, adding logs until it blazed hot. He melted snow in a kettle, the metal hissing as it warmed. He cut away the frozen, torn fabric of her dress. It was fine material, or had been, now ruined by mud and blood. Underneath, she wore only a thin chemise that offered no protection. The wound on her head was ugly, a deep gash above her temple, likely from a fall on the rocks. But she was breathing, shallow, but breathing. He tore a strip from a clean flour sack, dipped it in the hot water, and began to clean the wound. She woke as the hot cloth touched her skin. It was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent surge, a feral explosion. She gasped, a sound like a drowning animal, and threw herself backward, scrambling off the cot and landing hard on the plank floor. She crab-walked away from him until her back hit the wall, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost white. "No!" she choked, her voice a raw croak. "No, please don't!" Eli froze. He held his hands up, the bloody rag dripping onto the floor. "Easy," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "You're safe." "Safe?" she spat, and the word was a curse. She looked around wildly, for a weapon, for an escape. "Where am I? Who are you?" "You fell by the creek." He kept his voice low, steady. "The storm. You'll die out there." "He sent you," she whispered, shrinking, trying to make herself smaller. "He found me. I won't go back. I won't." "I don't know who you're talking about. Girl." He moved slowly, dipping the rag back into the bowl. "You hit your head. You're bleeding. Let me tend it." She watched him, every muscle coiled. She was a bobcat in a trap, ready to tear off its own leg to get free. He took one step closer. She flinched, a violent, full-body tremor. Eli stopped. He set the bowl and the rag on the floor, halfway between them. "The wound's dirty. It'll fester." He backed away and sat in his own chair by the fire, turning his back to her. It was the only thing he could offer. He picked up a piece of wood and his knife and began to whittle. The scrape of the blade on the wood the only sound besides her ragged breathing and the screaming wind outside. He sat that way for an hour. He heard her shiver. He heard her cry, a dry, broken sound she tried to smother. Finally, he heard a faint rustle. He did not turn. He heard the splash of water, a sharp intake of breath as she touched the wound herself. Then, silence again. He slept in the chair that night, his rifle leaning against the wall beside him. The storm raged for 4 more days. The snow piled up to the cabin's windows, sealing them in. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the small room. It was a truce held by the weather. Eli created a routine. He would rise before dawn, brave the storm to check his traps and bring in wood, his face covered by a wool scarf. He never found anything. The mountain was locked tight. When he returned, she would be awake, huddled on the cot, watching him. She never slept, not truly. She just rested, her eyes half closed, startling at every pop from the fire, every creak of the logs. He would make coffee and stew, thick with salted pork and dried beans. He would slide a bowl onto the floor near her, never getting close enough to spook her. He would return to his chair, and they would eat in silence. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman of none. On the 3rd day, the silence became too heavy, even for him. "Eli," he said, staring into the fire. She said nothing. "My name, it's Eli Mercer." She waited a long time. He could feel her gaze on his back. "Clara," she whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle. "Clara," he repeated. The name felt strange in the cabin, too soft for the hard edges of his life. She began to change. The abject terror faded, replaced by a deep, impenetrable weariness. She was still a wounded animal, but she no longer saw him as the trapper. He was just part of the landscape now. She started to move from the cot, drawn by the pull of the fire. She would sit on the floor, as far from him as she could get, wrapping one of his spare blankets around her shoulders. He had left the remains of her dress by the door, and she had spent a day mending the tears with a needle and thread from his kit. Her stitches were small and perfect. She watched his hands. She watched him clean his rifle, sharpen his knives, mend his own coat. He was powerful. She could see that in the set of his shoulders. But his movements were not violent. They were patient. They were sure. He demanded nothing of her. He did not ask her questions. He did not ask how she came to be in the snow. He did not ask who she was running from. He just existed, a quiet, solid presence that smelled of wood smoke and cold air. The safety of the cabin began to seep into her, but it was a confusing feeling. Safety, for her, had always been a lie. It was the quiet before the door opened, the soft word before the hard hand. She would find herself staring into the flames, and the cabin would melt away. She was 13 again. The wagon ride had been long, but the woman, Madame Eve, had been kind. She had promised Clara a job sewing, a warm bed, a home. The home was a house in Black Hollow with red velvet curtains and a piano that was always playing. The sewing was a lie. Her first night, the smell of cheap perfume and stale whiskey. The parlor, loud with men's laughter. Madame Eve, her smile fixed, pushing Clara forward. "This one is new. Gentlemen, fresh from the East." The shame had been a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that she had lived under for years. She had learned to make her mind go quiet, to float away, to become a thing. Things didn't feel. Then, 2 weeks ago, the house was quiet, late. A man named Barlow, a silver baron with a mean streak, was in the parlor. He liked the new girl, Sarah, who was barely 14. Clara had heard him yelling. She had gone down, found him with his hand raised, Sarah cowering. Clara had just wanted to get Sarah out of the room. She had grabbed his arm. The memory splintered, shouting, a table overturning, the heavy crystal decanter. Another man, Madame Eve's silent partner, lunging from the shadows, a glint of steel. Barlow had not gotten up. He had just stared at the ceiling, a knife sticking out of his chest, the red stain spreading across his white shirt. Madame Eve had looked at Clara, her eyes cold as stones. "You stupid girl! Look what you did!" Clara hadn't done it. She had seen the other man, but he was gone. It was just her and Sarah and the body. She ran. She had a few dollars saved. She ran out the back door, into the woods. She didn't know where she was going. She just ran until her lungs burned and her feet were bloody. She ran until the snow came. She ran until she couldn't run anymore. And then she fell by the creek, praying for the cold to take her. The log in the fireplace shifted, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Clara jumped, her hand flying to her throat. She was back in the cabin. Eli was watching her. His expression was unreadable. "You're safe here," he said again. It was the only thing he ever offered. "No, I'm not," she whispered, her voice shaking. She pulled the blanket tighter. "You're not safe. Not with me." He raised an eyebrow, a fractional movement. "You shouldn't have brought me here," she insisted, the words tumbling out. "I'm nothing but trouble. You don't understand. There are men. They're looking for me." Eli turned back to the fire. He had seen trouble. He had fled it himself, run clear across the country until there was nowhere left to run but up. He had seen what men did for gold, for land, for pride. A half-frozen girl running from trouble was just another part of the wilderness. "Trouble don't hunt in a blizzard," he said simply. "Rest. The storm's breaking." He wasn't scared of her. He wasn't even alarmed. He just accepted it. This confused her more than any kindness would have. She began to notice the landscape of him, just as she had noticed the cabin. He was haunted. She saw it in the moments he thought she wasn't looking, when he stared at the fire. His hand clenched so tight his knuckles were white. One morning, he was washing by the hearth, the early light gray through the window. He had pulled his wool shirt off. His back was to her. The left side of his back, from his shoulder down to his ribs, was a ruin of puckered, white and red tissue. An old burn, a bad one. She must have made a sound, a small intake of breath. He turned, not to face her, but just enough to see her. He caught her staring. His eyes went cold as the wind outside. He pulled the shirt on, his movements stiff. He didn't speak of it. She didn't ask. She saw the other part of his past through the snow-caked window. The storm had lessened, and she could make out the shape of a large pine tree about 50 yards from the cabin. At its base was a small mound, marked by a single, upright piece of wood, a grave. It was not marked with a name, just a simple carving of a branch. They were two ghosts in one small room, each one guarding the bones of the person they used to be. On the 5th day, the wind died. The silence that fell was shocking, absolute. "It's over," Eli said. He stood at the door, looking out at a world buried in white. "The pass will be clear by tomorrow." The truce was over. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. He was telling her to leave. She should have been relieved. She could run again, but the thought of leaving the warmth of the cabin, the strange, silent safety of this man, terrified her. "I have nowhere to go," she said, her voice small. Eli nodded, as if he expected this. "You can stay, until you're healed proper. Then you'll help. I'll need to check the high traps." Clara stared at him. He was offering her a chance. Not kindness, a bargain. Work for shelter. She nodded, unable to speak. The next day, the sound came. Eli heard it first. He was splitting wood by the door, and he went still. His axe held mid-swing. "What?" Clara asked. "Inside," he snapped. His voice was no longer quiet. It was sharp, a command. "Now." She heard it then. Horses, slogging through the deep snow. More than one. She scrambled inside. Eli followed, his face a hard mask. "There's a hatch," he said, pointing to a bearskin rug. "Under it, root cellar. Don't make a sound. Don't breathe. Understand?" Clara's blood ran cold. "They found me!" She ripped the rug back. The plank floor had a small, leather pull. She lifted it, revealing a black, earthen hole that smelled of damp and potatoes. She slid in, pulling the hatch closed over her head, leaving only a sliver of light. She heard Eli kick the rug back into place, heard the heavy tread of his boots as he walked to the door. She heard the men ride up, 2 of them, by the sound of the horses. "Mornin'," a gravelly voice called out. "Seen your smoke." Clara pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling her own breath. She heard Eli's low reply, "Snow's deep." "Tell me about it," the man said. He sounded close, just outside the door. "We're tracking game. Slipped out of Black Hollow about a week back. You seen anyone pass this way?" "Just the snow," Eli said. His voice was flat, empty. "It ain't deer we're hunting," the second man said, his voice meaner, sharper. "It's a woman, a murderin' whore from Eve's place. Killed a man, Barlow. Maybe you heard of him?" Silence. Clara's heart was a hammer against her ribs. Little thing," the first man continued. "Brown hair, scared eyes, answers to Clara. There's a $100 bounty on her, dead or alive." The cabin was silent for a long, terrible moment. Clara could picture Eli standing in the doorway, blocking the light, as immovable as the mountain. "Ain't seen a soul since first frost," Eli said. The words were slow, deliberate. "And I'd be obliged if you'd move your horses. You're standing on my lines." There was a tense pause. She heard the squeak of leather, a man shifting in his saddle. $100 is a lot of money, Mr. the sharp-voiced man said. "Keep your eyes peeled." "I keep my eyes on my traps," Eli replied. She heard them turn their horses, the snow crunching under their weight. She heard them ride away. She stayed in the dark, shaking so hard her teeth rattled. She waited, counting her own heartbeats. A long time later, the rug was pulled back. Light flooded the cellar. Eli's face was above her, silhouetted against the cabin light. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. He held out his hand. She flinched, ignoring the hand, and scrambled out of the hole. She stood in the middle of the room, breathing hard, looking at him as if he were a stranger again. She had heard it all. She had heard the description. She had heard the bounty. And she had heard his lie. He had saved her from the storm. Now, he had saved her from them. He hadn't just given her shelter. He had taken on her trouble. He had lied to armed men for a woman he didn't know. The fear was still there, a cold sickness in her stomach. But it was tangled with something new, something terrifying. It was the first time in her life that a man had stood between her and harm. She didn't know what that meant, and she was suddenly more afraid of him than she had been of the bounty hunters. The cabin was a prison of silence. After the bounty hunters had gone, the air inside had changed. It was no longer a shared shelter. It was a cage. Clara sat on the cot, her hands knotted together, watching Eli. He had lied for her. He had put a rope around his own neck for her. A stranger, a woman who had admitted she was trouble. That night, she could not close her eyes. Every time she drifted, she saw the mean, sharp face of the second man, heard him say dead or alive. She saw Eli standing in the doorway, a solid wall of shadow. He had not gone to his cot. He never did. He sat in his chair by the fire, his rifle resting against his knee. He was not asleep. She knew he was listening, waiting for the sound of their return. She could not bear it. The weight of his lie was heavier than the snow, more suffocating than the brothel's perfume. He had saved her, and in doing so, he had doomed himself. She waited until the fire burned down to red gold embers, until the shadows in the corners of the room grew deep. His breathing was slow and even, the first time she had heard him truly rest since she arrived. She moved like smoke. She did not put on her own ruined boots. They were too loud. She slipped her feet into his spare moccasins. She grabbed the mended wool coat he had given her. It was thin, torn near the shoulder. But it was something. She did not look back. She lifted the latch on the heavy door, easing it open just enough to slip through. The cold was a shock, a solid thing that punched the air from her lungs. The moon was a sliver of ice in a black sky, and the snow reflected a pale, ghostly light. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. She plunged into the drifts, following the deep trench the bounty hunters' horses had made. She thought she could follow it back, away from him, away from this mountain. She would draw them off. She would be the bait, and he would be free of her. The snow was deeper than she thought, clinging to the coat, dragging her down. It was not snow, it was sand. It was quicksand. Every step was a battle. The wind found every tear in the coat. The moccasins were soaked through in an instant. She made it, perhaps 100 yards. She fell, scrambling to her feet, and fell again. Her hands, bare, were already numb. She looked at them, confused. They were white, like marble. She tried to make a fist, but the muscles would not obey. "You won't make it to the creek." His voice came from the darkness behind her. She gasped, spinning around. He was standing not 10 feet away, a dark shape against the snow, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not even breathing hard. "Go back inside, Eli," she pleaded, her teeth chattering. "They'll follow me, not you." "They'll follow the tracks," he said, his voice flat. "And there are 2 sets now. I won't be the reason you hang." He walked toward her, his steps sure and heavy. He did not stop until he was looming over her. She cringed, expecting a blow, expecting him to drag her back. Instead, he just looked down at her, his face lost in the shadow of his hat. He pointed at her hands, which she was clutching to her chest. "Your fingers are freezing," he stated. It was not an accusation, just a fact. "Another 10 minutes and they'll turn black. Then they'll fall off." He waited. He didn't reach for her. He didn't force her. He just waited. "I won't die," she whispered, a desperate, childish lie. "If you run again, you'll die," he said, his voice quiet, scraping like stone. "If you stay, you've got a chance." He turned his back on her and started walking toward the cabin. She stayed in the snow, watching him. Die out here, alone in the cold, or go back and face the man who had lied for her. She sobbed, a dry, ragged sound, and staggered after him, falling into his tracks, back toward the small, smoking chimney. He had the fire blazing by the time she stumbled through the door. He kicked it shut behind her. "Sit," he commanded. She collapsed onto the stool near the hearth. He grabbed a bucket of snow from outside and thrust her hands into it. The pain was immediate, a fire of needles that shot up her arms. She cried out, trying to pull away. "Hold still," he ordered, his grip on her wrists like an iron band. "It's the only way." He held her there, forcing her to endure the thawing, until she was limp, shaking, tears of pure agony streaming down her face. When he finally let go, her hands were red and raw, but they were hers. He threw a blanket over her shoulders and pushed a tin cup of hot coffee into her new, stinging fingers. He went back to his chair, picked up his knife, and began to sharpen it, the shing, shing, shing of steel on stone filling the small room. The silence stretched, tighter and tighter, until Clara thought it would snap her in two. "Why?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. He did not stop sharpening the blade. "Why did you lie to them? You don't know me. I told you I was trouble. They offered $100. "I don't need their money," he said, not looking up. "They'll come back, and when they do, they'll have to find me." "They'll find you," she insisted, desperation making her bold. "Because of me. You should have let me freeze. It would have been cleaner." He stopped. He laid the knife and stone on the small table beside him. He stared into the fire, his profile hard, the light catching the ridges of his scars. "Why do you live here?" she asked, her voice softer. "All alone? Why this place?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. She thought he would rise and go to the door, leaving her with her questions. "I had a brother," he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean forward to hear it. "Josiah, he was a preacher, a good man, believed in things, believed in the word of God and the word of the government." He picked up a stick from the woodpile and jammed it into the fire, watching the end of it glow. "We had land, back in Ohio, good bottom land. The railroad came through. They wanted it. Josiah had papers, said the land was ours, signed and sealed. The railroad boss, a man named Heston, he had hired guns." He paused. His grip on the stick tightened until his knuckles were white. "Josiah went out to meet them, thought he could reason with them. He held up his Bible, started talking about bearing false witness. They shot him in the back while he was reading." Clara put a hand over her mouth. "I buried him," Eli said, his voice devoid of all feeling. "I buried him next to his wife, Rose. She had died of fever the winter before. Then I went into town. I waited until dark." He looked at his hands. "They had a payroll shack right by the new tracks, full of cash to pay their crews. I had 2 cans of kerosene." He lifted his head, and his eyes met hers across the fire. They were not cold. They were burning. "It went up fast, faster than I thought. The whole sky turned orange. I heard them screaming. I got out, but—" He made a vague gesture toward his shoulder. "The one she had seen. The fire got a piece of me, too. I reckon that was fair. They said the foreman was in there, counting the money. I don't know if that's true. I didn't wait to find out. I stole a horse and rode west. I didn't stop riding until I hit these mountains." He tossed the glowing stick into the fire. "I live here because I've buried everyone I ever cared about. I live here because I'm done with men, and I'm done with their laws. Your trouble is just trouble. It's no different from a blizzard or a wolf pack. It's just something to be survived." The cabin was silent again, but the silence had a new shape. It was filled with his ghosts, and with hers. "They call me a murderer," she whispered, her hands cradling the hot cup. "But I didn't do it." He waited. He gave her the same thing he had given her in the snow, the space to make a choice. "There was a girl," Clara said, her eyes fixed on the flames. Sarah. She was new, only 14. Madame Eve, the woman who runs the house. She put Sarah with a man, Barlow. He was rich, from the silver mines, and he was mean. She was back there, smelling the stale whiskey and the rosewater. I heard him hit her. I heard her cry. I went down. I just wanted to get her out of the room. I grabbed his arm. He turned on me. He was drunk. He raised his hand. And then someone else was there. A man, the madam's partner, the one who stays in the shadows. I saw him. I think I saw him. He had a knife. She was shaking. Barlow fell. He just fell. The knife was in his chest, and the other man was gone. Just gone. Vanished. It was just me, and Sarah, and the body. Madame Eve came in. She looked at me. She smiled. She said I'd finally earned my keep. She called the sheriff and said I'd done it. She looked up, her eyes desperate, pleading with him to believe her. I just ran. I didn't kill him. Eli. But I know it doesn't matter. They won't care. A girl like me, from a place like that, they don't ask questions. They just find a rope. He nodded slowly. He believed her. It was that simple. He had no reason to, but he did. A strange quiet settled between them. It was not peace, but it was something close. It was the understanding of two people who had both been burned, who had both run as far as they could. The air in the small cabin grew thick. The fire was hot, painting their faces in shades of red and gold. She looked at him, at the lines around his mouth, the exhaustion in his eyes. He was not a savior. He was just a man, as broken as she was. He looked at her, at the raw skin of her hands, the dark circles under her eyes, the tangled mess of her hair. He saw the terror that lived behind her gaze. He didn't know when he started to move. He leaned forward in his chair. She, sitting on the stool, leaned toward him. The space between them shrank. It was only inches. He could smell the soap he'd given her, the faint scent of wood smoke in her hair. He lifted a hand, his calloused, scarred fingers touching her cheek. A loud crack echoed through the cabin. Clara screamed. She threw herself backward, scrambling off the stool, landing hard against the log wall. Her eyes were wide, white, her hands up as if to ward off a blow. She was gone. The woman who had confessed was gone, and the terrified animal was back. Eli froze, his hand still in the air. He looked at the fire. A log had split, collapsing in on itself and sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Just the fire, he said, his voice rough. He stood up, his body stiff. The spell was broken, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He picked up his rifle. I'll check the perimeter. He left, plunging into the cold night, leaving her alone, shaking by the dying flames. The next days were different. The confessions and the broken moment had changed the shape of their silence. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the things they had said and the things they had not done. Eli needed meat. The blizzard had scattered the game, and his traps were empty. He couldn't leave her, not with bounty hunters in the valley, and she couldn't stay, not with the memory of that near kiss hanging in the air. You're coming, he said one morning. He handed her a pair of his old snowshoes and a small skinning knife. Stay behind me. Don't talk, and do exactly as I say. She nodded. Anything was better than the cabin. The wilderness was his church. She watched him move. He was not a man walking on the land. He was a part of it. He read the snow like a book. He saw the faint depression where a rabbit had passed, the scrape of a claw on bark. He taught her. He didn't speak, just pointed. He pointed to a track. Deer. He'd grunt. He'd hold up a hand. And she would freeze, listening. She learned to hear the snap of a twig under the wind, the cry of a hawk miles away. She was good at it. Her life had depended on being quiet, on noticing the shift in a man's mood, the tightening of a hand. This was the same. The mountain was just a different kind of master. They found their traps raided, torn apart, the bait gone. Wolves, Eli growled. He knelt, touching the huge tracks. A pack. Clara felt a prickle on her neck. She scanned the ridge above them. A flicker of movement. Not one, 3. Gray shadows against the white. They were watching. She didn't gasp. She didn't move. She just touched Eli's arm and pointed. He looked up. His eyes met the gaze of the alpha. He nodded slowly. A flicker of something passed over his face. Respect. He stood, and they moved on, leaving the wolves to their ridge. They were in a thicket of pine, checking a snare line. When the air changed, the wind stopped. The forest went dead silent. Eli grabbed her, pulling her behind him. "Don't move," he whispered. "Don't even breathe." He raised his rifle. It rose from the snow not 20 yards away. A grizzly, awakened from its slumber. Angry and hungry, it stood on its hind legs, a mountain of fur and rage. It roared, a sound that shook the trees, that seemed to stop Clara's heart. "Eli," she breathed. "I said don't move." His voice was iron. The bear dropped to all fours and charged. The world slowed. Clara saw the snow flying from its paws, the flash of its yellow teeth. Eli did not move. He waited until the beast was 10 yards away. The rifle boomed. The sound was deafening, the kick throwing Eli back a step. The bear stumbled, but it did not fall. It lunged, enraged, its claws extended. Eli worked the lever, firing again. The shot went wide. Clara screamed. She didn't think. She raised the skinning knife and ran at the bear's side, plunging the small blade into its thick hide. It was like stabbing a mountain. The bear roared, swatting at her. The blow caught her on the shoulder, sending her flying into a snowdrift. The distraction was all Eli needed. He jammed the rifle barrel almost against the bear's head and fired a third time. The massive animal collapsed, its head landing just inches from Eli's boots. Silence, the ringing in Clara's ears, the smell of gunpowder and blood. Eli was breathing hard, his face pale. He looked at Clara, who was struggling to sit up in the drift. "I told you," he panted, "not to move." You missed," she whispered, her shoulder throbbing. A small, strange sound left his chest. It was almost a laugh. "So I did." He walked over, his legs shaking, and pulled her to her feet. "You're hurt." "It just hit me," she said. He helped her back to the cabin. His hand was firm on her good arm. He had a long, shallow gash on his forearm, where one of the claws had grazed him. Back inside, they didn't speak. They were both shaking, the reaction setting in. He poured whiskey. He drank one. He handed her the cup. She drank, the liquor burning a trail to her stomach. He sat, and she took the water basin. She tore a strip from her chemise. She washed the blood from his arm. He winced, but he let her. His skin was warm. This touch was different. It was not comfort. It was not desire. It was work. It was mending. He watched her fingers, small and red, as they cleaned his wound. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "We saved each other," she replied. That night, the cold came back, harder than before. Clara lay on her cot, under her one blanket. The whiskey had worn off, and her shoulder ached. But it was not the pain that made her shiver. It was the bear, the roar, the closeness of death. She was shaking, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that started in her belly and radiated out. She was back in Black Hollow. She was back at the creek. She was under the bear. Eli saw her. He was sitting in his chair, staring at the fire. He stood, walked over, and took the heavy bear fur from his own cot. He draped it over her. It smelled of him, of pine smoke and cold air. She burrowed into it, but the shaking wouldn't stop. He turned to walk away. "Eli!" Her voice was a thread. He stopped. She reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. He went still. He looked at her hand, then at her face. He pulled his arm back, as if her touch had burned him. "Clara," he said, his voice strained. "Don't. I won't be one of them. I won't be another man who takes—" His rejection was a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. I'm not offering that," she choked. The shame was suffocating. "I'm cold," she whispered, the tears breaking free, streaming down her temples. "I'm just so cold. I need to feel human again. Just for a minute. Please, I'm so tired of being scared." Her words broke him. He saw her, truly saw her. Not a whore, not a victim. Just a woman, frozen to her very soul, begging for warmth. He looked at the cot, then at her. He made his decision. He did not sit on the edge. He lifted the heavy furs and slid in beside her, his body rigid. The cot was narrow, forcing them close. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling. She lay beside him, her back to him, still shaking. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice rough. "You're safe. It's over." She turned, slowly, to face him. In the dim, red light from the embers, she could see the pain in his own eyes. "Is it?" she asked. He moved slowly, with a deliberation that was almost agonizing. He raised his hand, the one she had bandaged, and laid it on her good shoulder. His touch was warm, heavy. It did not grab. It did not demand. It just rested. She leaned into his palm, a desperate, silent cat. He moved his other hand, tracing the line of her jaw with one rough finger. He wiped a tear from her cheek. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of breath. It was a promise. It was, "I am here." She kissed him back, a small, frightened movement. He pulled her closer, and his mouth became more insistent, but still slow, still careful. He was checking her, watching her eyes, giving her every chance to pull away. She did not pull away. She wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling herself against the solid warmth of his chest. His hands were tender, impossibly so for a man who killed bears and split logs. He moved with a restraint that was a revelation. He touched her hair, her face, her shoulders, as if he were learning a language. He was constantly checking her comfort. "Clara," he would murmur against her skin. She would just nod, her eyes closed, her tears still leaking. It was the first time her body was not a battlefield, the first time she had been asked, the first time she had been allowed to want. It was the first time a man's touch didn't hurt. That night changed the air. When the sun rose, cold and bright, the silence in the cabin was no longer a thing of fear, but of waiting. The shame that had clung to Clara like a shroud had, for a few hours, been lifted. She woke first, tucked against Eli's warmth, his breathing a slow, steady rumble in his chest. She watched the light creep across the plank floor, and for the first time since she was a child, she did not wish the night back. He woke with a stillness, his eyes opening to find her watching him. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his gaze clear and searching. He was looking for the terror, for the flinch. She offered him a small, fragile smile. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, and the hard lines around his mouth softened. A new rhythm began. It was a life built of shared burdens. The truce of the storm had ended. The alliance of survival had begun. Eli took her hunting in earnest now, not just as a follower, but as a partner. He taught her how to truly walk in the woods, how to place her feet to make no sound, how to read the bend of a frozen branch. "You look for what's wrong," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "A patch of snow that ain't smooth, a branch that's broken. The woods are all order. Trouble is the thing that don't belong." She learned. She found the snare line he had lost in the storm. She spotted the snowshoe hair he had missed, its white fur a perfect camouflage against the drift. He let her take the shot with his spare rifle. She missed, the shot kicking up snow a foot to the left, but he only nodded. "You pulled," he said. "Don't think about the noise. Just think about the target." They gathered wood together, working the two-man saw, its teeth singing a rhythmic shing-shing back and forth as they cut through fallen pine. Her arms, thin and pale, grew strong, the muscles knotting with purpose. He brought back a small buck, and they worked late into the night, skinning and butchering it by the light of the fire. Her hands were slick with blood, and she felt no revulsion. This was life. This was the meat that would keep them from starving. It was clean. It was honest. They washed their few clothes in the creek, the water so cold it stole their breath. He would stand guard, his rifle cradled, while she scrubbed the cloth on the flat, icy rocks. He would watch the ridges, his eyes scanning the tree line. A silent guardian. This domestic peace was a thin blanket, stretched taut over the ever-present danger. They both knew the bounty hunters were out there. The first man, the gravel-voiced one, had not been with his partner. That meant there was at least one more, maybe two. The cabin was their fortress, but it was also a trap. They never let the fire go out, but they never let it smoke too much during the day. Clara began to change. The haunted, hollow-eyed creature he had pulled from the snow was receding. Color returned to her cheeks. The bruises from her fall had faded, and the wound on her temple was now just a thin, red scar. One afternoon, she was mending his shirt, the one torn by the bear's claw. The cabin was warm. The stew bubbled over the fire. She found herself humming, a small, absent sound. It was an old song, something about a river, a tune her mother had sung a lifetime ago. She stopped, her hand freezing, the needle halfway through the wool. Eli was sitting across from her, oiling the action of his rifle. He had stopped, too. He was watching her. His face was still, but his eyes were full of a quiet, aching awe. He had seen this valley in all its seasons. He had seen the ice break on the river, the eagle's nest on the high peaks, the sudden, violent beauty of an avalanche. But he had never seen anything like this woman, mending his shirt, humming a half-forgotten tune in his cabin. It was the most fragile, powerful thing he had ever witnessed. Clara blushed, a deep crimson that spread from her neck to her hairline. "It's just a stupid song." "No," he said, his voice rough. "It ain't." He went back to his rifle, and she went back to her sewing, but the air was charged, thick with what was unspoken. That night, the tension that had been simmering since their first touch finally boiled over. They had eaten. The silence was comfortable. Eli was carving a small piece of wood. He was trying to make a handle for his skinning knife. His large, scarred hands were clumsy with the detail work. The blade slipped, skittering across the wood and ruining the notch he had spent an hour on. "Damn it!" he growled, a sound of pure frustration. He threw the piece of wood into the fire. Clara laughed. It was not a giggle. It was not a nervous titter. It was a full, clear, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a spring thaw, of ice breaking. The sound filled the small cabin, startling them both. Eli stared at her, his anger forgotten. He had heard her scream. He had heard her weep. He had never, ever heard her laugh. The laughter died in her throat, her eyes wide. The mood shifted. The air crackled. The space between them, warmed by the fire, became a palpable thing, a live wire. She did not think. She was tired of fear, tired of hesitating. She had been a victim. She had been a survivor. Now, she simply wanted to be a woman. She leaned forward from her stool, closing the 3 feet between them. She put her hands on his knees, leaned in, and kissed him. He froze. For one heartbeat, he was as still as the stone hearth. This was not a plea for comfort in the dark. This was not a shiver against the cold. This was daylight. This was a choice. This was her choice. Then he moved. He dropped the knife. His hands, no longer clumsy, went to her face. He kissed her back. It was not the gentle, questioning kiss from the cot. This was hungry. This was a starving man presented with a feast. It was the raw, desperate need of his 6 years of solitude colliding with her lifetime of pain. He pulled her off the stool and onto his lap, his mouth devouring hers. It was a kiss of fire and gunpowder, of pine resin and desperation. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the thick muscle of his shoulders, meeting his hunger with her own. This was not a taking. This was a claiming. They fell into each other, a tangle of limbs and blankets, moving from the chair to the cot in a clumsy, urgent dance. Their lovemaking was not gentle. It was intense. It was a battle. It was a prayer. For Eli, it was an exorcism of the ghosts that haunted him, the memory of the fire, the coldness of the grave. He was, for the first time, anchored to the living, not the dead. For Clara, it was a reclamation. Every touch, every kiss, every press of his skin against hers was erasing the past. It was washing away the shame, the filth, the feeling of being a discarded thing. This was not submission. This was power. This was her body, her choice, her desire. It was almost spiritual, a violent, sacred act of two broken people making each other whole. They collapsed, breathing hard, slick with sweat. The furs tangled around them. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was quiet again. And then Clara began to weep. They were not the tears of pain or fear. They were silent, heavy tears of release. The wall she had built around herself, the one that had kept her alive, had finally crumbled. She wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she had just become, and for the simple, terrifying fact that she was. For the first, of course. Here is the continuation of the story. That night changed the air. When the sun rose, cold and bright, the silence in the cabin was no longer a thing of fear, but of waiting. The shame that had clung to Clara like a shroud had, for a few hours, been lifted. She woke first, tucked against Eli's warmth, his breathing a slow, steady rumble in his chest. She watched the light creep across the plank floor, and for the first time since she was a child, she did not wish the night back. He woke with a stillness, his eyes opening to find her watching him. He did not speak. He just looked at her, his gaze clear and searching. He was looking for the terror, for the flinch. She offered him a small, fragile smile. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years, and the hard lines around his mouth softened. A new rhythm began. It was a life built of shared burdens. The truce of the storm had ended. The alliance of survival had begun. Eli took her hunting in earnest now, not just as a follower, but as a partner. He taught her how to truly walk in the woods, how to place her feet to make no sound, how to read the bend of a frozen branch. "You look for what's wrong," he told her, his voice a low rumble. "A patch of snow that ain't smooth, a branch that's broken. The woods are all order. Trouble is the thing that don't belong." She learned. She found the snare line he had lost in the storm. She spotted the snowshoe hair he had missed, its white fur a perfect camouflage against the drift. He let her take the shot with his spare rifle. She missed, the shot kicking up snow a foot to the left, but he only nodded. "You pulled," he said. "Don't think about the noise. Just think about the target." They gathered wood together, working the two-man saw, its teeth singing a rhythmic shing-shing back and forth as they cut through fallen pine. Her arms, thin and pale, grew strong, the muscles knotting with purpose. He brought back a small buck, and they worked late into the night, skinning and butchering it by the light of the fire. Her hands were slick with blood, and she felt no revulsion. This was life. This was the meat that would keep them from starving. It was clean. It was honest. They washed their few clothes in the creek, the water so cold it stole their breath. He would stand guard, his rifle cradled, while she scrubbed the cloth on the flat, icy rocks. He would watch the ridges, his eyes scanning the tree line, a silent guardian. This domestic peace was a thin blanket, stretched taut over the ever-present danger. They both knew the bounty hunters were out there. The first man, the gravel-voiced one, had not been with his partner. That meant there was at least one more, maybe two. The cabin was their fortress, but it was also a trap. They never let the fire go out, but they never let it smoke too much during the day. Clara began to change. The haunted, hollow-eyed creature he had pulled from the snow was receding. Color returned to her cheeks. The bruises from her fall had faded, and the wound on her temple was now just a thin, red scar. One afternoon, she was mending his shirt, the one torn by the bear's claw. The cabin was warm. The stew bubbled over the fire. She found herself humming a small, absent sound. It was an old song, something about a river, a tune her mother had sung a lifetime ago. She stopped, her hand freezing, the needle halfway through the wool. Eli was sitting across from her, oiling the action of his rifle. He had stopped, too. He was watching her. His face was still, but his eyes were full of a quiet, aching awe. He had seen this valley in all its seasons. He had seen the ice break on the river, the eagle's nest on the high peaks, the sudden, violent beauty of an avalanche. But he had never seen anything like this. This woman, mending his shirt, humming a half-forgotten tune in his cabin. It was the most fragile, powerful thing he had ever witnessed. Clara blushed, a deep crimson that spread from her neck to her hairline. "It's just a stupid song." "No," he said, his voice rough. "It ain't." He went back to his rifle, and she went back to her sewing, but the air was charged, thick with what was unspoken. That night, the tension that had been simmering since their first touch finally boiled over. They had eaten. The silence was comfortable. Eli was carving a small piece of wood. He was trying to make a handle for his skinning knife. His large, scarred hands were clumsy with the detail work. The blade slipped, skittering across the wood and ruining the notch he had spent an hour on. "Damn it!" he growled, a sound of pure frustration. He threw the piece of wood into the fire. Clara laughed. It was not a giggle. It was not a nervous titter. It was a full, clear, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a spring thaw, of ice breaking. The sound filled the small cabin, startling them both. Eli stared at her, his anger forgotten. He had heard her scream. He had heard her weep. He had never, ever heard her laugh. The laughter died in her throat, her eyes wide. The mood shifted. The air crackled. The space between them, warmed by the fire, became a palpable thing, a live wire. She did not think. She was tired of fear, tired of hesitating. She had been a victim. She had been a survivor. Now, she simply wanted to be a woman. She leaned forward from her stool, closing the 3 feet between them. She put her hands on his knees, leaned in, and kissed him. He froze. For one heartbeat, he was as still as the stone hearth. This was not a plea for comfort in the dark. This was not a shiver against the cold. This was daylight. This was a choice. This was her choice. Then he moved. He dropped the knife. His hands, no longer clumsy, went to her face. He kissed her back. It was not the gentle, questioning kiss from the cot. This was hungry. This was a starving man presented with a feast. It was the raw, desperate need of his 6 years of solitude colliding with her lifetime of pain. He pulled her off the stool and onto his lap, his mouth devouring hers. It was a kiss of fire and gunpowder, of pine resin and desperation. She clung to him, her fingers digging into the thick muscle of his shoulders, meeting his hunger with her own. This was not a taking. This was a claiming. They fell into each other, a tangle of limbs and blankets. moving from the chair to the cot in a clumsy, urgent dance. Their love-making was not gentle. It was intense. It was a battle. It was a prayer. For Eli, it was an exorcism of the ghosts that haunted him, the memory of the fire, the coldness of the grave. He was, for the first time, anchored to the living, not the dead. For Clara, it was a reclamation. Every touch, every kiss, every press of his skin against hers was erasing the past. It was washing away the shame, the filth, the feeling of being a discarded thing. This was not submission. This was power. This was her body, her choice, her desire. It was almost spiritual, a violent, sacred act of two broken people making each other whole. They collapsed, breathing hard, slick with sweat. The furs tangled around them. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was quiet again. And then Clara began to weep. They were not the tears of pain or fear. They were silent, heavy tears of release. The wall she had built around herself, the one that had kept her alive, had finally crumbled. She wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she had just become, and for the simple, terrifying fact that she was, for the first time in her life, safe. Eli did not ask why. He did not speak. He did not offer empty comfort. He just held her. He pulled the heavy furs over their shoulders, his arm a solid, warm bar across her stomach. He held her until the shaking stopped, and she finally, truly, slept. The domestic peace lasted for 3 more days. It was a stolen time, a pocket of warmth in a frozen world. But the shadow that hunted them was still moving. Eli had to check his high traps, a line set on the ridge 2 miles north. He had put it off, but they needed the pelts for trade. He stood at the door, his rifle in hand. "I don't like leaving you," he said, his brow furrowed. "I'll be fine," she said, touching his arm. She felt strong. She felt safe. "I'll bar the door. I won't go out." He hesitated. "If you hear anything, you don't hide in the cellar. You go to the loft. You stay quiet." "I will," she promised. He kissed her, a hard, quick kiss, and was gone, disappearing into the pines. Clara barred the door. The cabin felt too quiet, too empty. She busied herself, stoking the fire, sweeping the hearth. She was scrubbing the stew pot when she heard it. A horse, a single horse, moving slowly, picking its way through the snow. Her blood turned to ice. It was not Eli's heavy, familiar tread. This was cautious. This was a hunter. She ran to the small, greasy window and peered through a clear patch. It was him, the one from the clearing, the one with the sharp, mean voice. He sat on his horse 100 yards away, studying the cabin, his eyes fixed on the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She looked at the root cellar. "You don't hide in the cellar." She scrambled up the crude ladder to the loft, the small, dark space where Eli stored his cured hides. It smelled of salt and dried blood and dust. She pulled the heavy, stiff pelts over her, leaving only a tiny gap to see through. She clutched the skinning knife Eli had given her, her hand so tight the knuckles were white. She heard the man dismount, heard the crunch of his boots in the snow. He banged on the door, a heavy, rattling pound. "Hello, the cabin. I know you're in there. Mercer, we need to talk about that woman." Clara held her breath, pressing her face into the musty fur. Silence. Then, a heavy thud as he put his shoulder to the door. The bar held. Another crash. The wood groaned. "Open this door, damn you. I know she's in there. My partner went back to town, but I know a liar when I see one." Another violent slam. The bar splintered. The door flew open, crashing against the wall. He stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright snow. He was tall and thin, wearing a long duster, his face raw from the wind. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the room. "Well, Now, he sneered, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He stepped inside. Clara watched, frozen, from the loft. He saw the cot, the tangle of blankets. He saw the 2 tin cups by the hearth. He saw Clara's mended dress, hanging on a peg to dry. He smiled, a slow, ugly twisting of his lips. Knew it, the mountain man found himself a pet, a filthy $100 pet. He walked to the hearth, kicking her stool over. "Where you hidin', girl? In the floor?" He ripped the bare rug aside and kicked the cellar hatch open. He peered into the darkness. Empty. He turned, his gaze sweeping the room. It landed on the ladder. It traveled up, to the pile of furs. "Ah," he breathed. "There you are, like a rat in a nest." He started up the ladder. "Come on out, girl. I'll make it easy on you. Barlow's family will pay just as much for you, warm as cold, maybe more." Clara didn't wait. She couldn't. The terror that had paralyzed her turned to pure, feral rage. She was not a girl in a brothel. She was not a victim by the creek. She screamed, a high animal sound, and lunged from the furs, the skinning knife held high. She came down on top of him, taking him by surprise. The knife plunged deep into the thick wool of his shoulder. He roared, a sound of shock and pain, grabbing her, tearing her from the ladder. They fell to the cabin floor in a heap. He was strong. He backhanded her, the force of the blow snapping her head back, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. The knife flew from her hand, skittering across the floor. "You bitch!" he snarled, blood pouring from his shoulder. He fumbled for his pistol. "I'll kill you right here!" Clara scrambled, clawing at his face. She was not fighting for her life. She was fighting for Eli. She raked her nails across his eyes. He screamed, blinded, swatting at her. She bit his hand, her teeth sinking to the bone. He bellowed and threw her off, raising his pistol. The world exploded in a single deafening boom. It was not his pistol. It was the cannon shot of Eli's rifle, fired from the doorway. The bounty hunter froze. A dark, wet circle blossomed in the middle of his chest. He looked down, a strange, confused expression on his face. He looked at Clara. He looked at the broken doorway. Eli stood there, his face a mask of black fury, his rifle smoking. The bounty hunter crumpled, falling face first onto the hearthstone, his pistol clattering from his lifeless hand. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the ringing in Clara's ears and the sound of her own ragged gasps. She was on the floor, her lips split, her body already blooming with new bruises. Eli did not move. He looked at the dead man. He looked at the blood spreading across his hearth. He looked at Clara, huddled by the wall. He worked the rifle's lever, ejecting the spent cartridge. The brass casing tinkled as it hit the floor. Clara began to shake. It started in her hands and spread through her whole body, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. "I told you," she whispered, her voice broken. "I told you I am nothing, nothing but trouble, nothing but blood." Eli walked past her, his face like carved stone. He nudged the body with his boot. It was still. "You killed him," she sobbed, the tears cutting clean paths through the grime on her face. "God forgive me. You killed him, for me." "I killed him," Eli said, his voice flat, "because he broke my door, and he put his hands on you." She crawled backward, pressing herself against the logs. "It's a curse. It's me. I bring it. Anyone who helps me, anyone who touches me, they get blood on their hands. You have to let me go." Eli stared at the dead man for a long time. Then he turned, grabbed the man by his boots, and dragged the body outside, leaving a dark, wet trail across the floor. He took his shovel from against the wall. He walked past the small, marked grave under the pine tree, going another 50 yards, to a patch of bare ground where the snow was thin. Clara watched from the broken doorway. Wrapped in a blanket, she watched him dig. The ground was hard, frozen. It was brutal work. He did not stop. He just dug, the steady scrape of the shovel the only sound in the valley. It took him an hour. He pushed the body into the shallow hole and covered it, tamping the earth down with his boots. He did not say a prayer. He did not mark the grave. He walked back to the cabin. He was covered in sweat and dirt, his face grim. He stopped in front of her. "I have to go," she said, her voice dead, her eyes empty. I won't be the reason you hang. The other one will come back. I have to go." Eli's eyes, which had been cold and empty, suddenly blazed. He took a step toward her. She flinched, expecting a blow. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Don't you dare walk out on me." He jabbed a finger toward the unmarked grave, and then toward the one under the pine tree. "I've already buried too many. I'm done burying people. I'm not burying you." "But, Eli," she protested, confused by his fury. "The other man, he'll be back. With the sheriff. They'll find the grave. They'll find us." "Aye," Eli said, his voice hard. "He will, which is why we ain't staying here." He turned, grabbing his satchel. He began to move with a fierce, decisive energy. He tossed dried venison, ammunition, and his spare knife into the bag. "We can't run," he said, not looking at her. "We run. We'll be running forever. You'll always be looking over your shoulder. That ain't a life." He stopped and fixed her with his gaze. "You told me you didn't kill that man in Black Hollow." "I didn't." "You said there was another man, the madam's man." "Yes, I think so." "Then that's where we go." Clara's blood ran cold. "Go! Go where?" "South," he said. "Back to that town. Back to Black Hollow." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, Eli, they'll hang me. They'll hang me before I can say a word." "They'll hang you if they catch you here, too," he said, his voice rough. "This is done. Hiding is done. The only way out is through. You want to be free. We go make you free. We find the man who did it. We find your proof." He looked around the small cabin, at the broken door, the shattered window, the dark, ugly stain on his hearth. "This place," he said, "is finished." He walked to the corner and picked up the tin of kerosene he used for his lamps. "What are you—" He began to splash the oil on the cots, on the pile of furs in the loft, on the floorboard stained with blood. He handed her the box of matches. "We leave nothing," he said. "We leave no trail. We leave no one to follow. We burn it. We burn it all." She looked at the matches, then at his hard, set face. He was not just burning a cabin. He was burning his old life. He was burning his solitude. He was choosing her. He went outside, saddled his horse, and packed the last of their gear. He stood by the horse's head, waiting. Clara stood in the doorway. She struck a match. The small flame trembled in her hand. She looked at the room that had been her prison, her sanctuary, her deliverance. She threw the match onto the oil-soaked floor. The cabin went up with a sudden, violent whoosh. The heat pushed her backward. The flames devoured the logs, the cot, the blood, the memories. Eli reached down and pulled her up, seating her in front of him on the saddle. He swung up behind her, his body a solid wall at her back. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her tight against his chest. "Hold on," he said, his voice low in her ear. He grabbed the reins, turned the horse away from the inferno, and kicked it into a trot. They rode south, away from the pillar of black smoke that rose high into the cold mountain air, staining the sky. They rode south, away from the column of smoke that marked the grave of Eli's old life. There was no trail, only the sun as their guide. The horse, a strong bay gelding, bore their combined weight, but the progress was slow. They moved through a world of brutal, blinding white. The cold was a living thing, a predator that stalked them day and night. It gnawed at their hands and feet, turned their breath to sharp needles of ice, and leached the warmth from their bones. They crossed ridges scoured clean by the wind, the rock beneath slick with ice. They forded rivers where the water ran black and sluggish, plates of ice grinding against the horse's legs. Clara would ride until her legs were numb. Then she would slide off and walk, stumbling through the drifts, to spare the horse and keep her own blood moving. Eli walked beside her, his rifle always ready, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. They spoke little. Words were an effort, stolen by the wind. Their communication was in a touch of the hand, a shared look, the passing of the jerky and hardtack that made up their scant meals. On the fourth day, Eli began to slow. He had been favoring his left arm, the one the bear had gashed. He had cleaned it and stitched it himself in the cabin. But the journey, the relentless cold, and the strain of the ride had taken their toll. Clara first noticed him swaying in the saddle. By midday, he was slumped forward, his forehead resting on the horse's mane. "Eli," she said, her voice sharp with a new fear. She reached back, touching his cheek. His skin was dry, burning hot. He slid from the saddle, not in a controlled dismount, but in a heavy fall, catching himself just before he hit the ground. He leaned against the horse, his body shaking with a violent ague, his teeth chattering. "It's just the cold," he mumbled, but his eyes were too bright, glassy with fever. "It's the wound," she said, her voice firm. She was no longer the frightened girl. She was the only thing standing between him and the graves he feared. "We have to stop, now." "Can't," he argued, his voice thick. "They'll be tracking the smoke. Have to keep moving." "We'll die if we move," she countered. She grabbed the horse's reins. "We stop." She found a shallow overhang of rock, barely a cave, but it broke the worst of the wind. She got him off his feet, rolling him onto their shared bedroll. He was a dead weight. She piled the furs and their one blanket on top of him, but he was still shaking. She built a small, smokeless fire of dry aspen wood she found jammed in the rocks. It was a risk, but a smaller one than letting him freeze. With the fire going, she pulled back the furs. "I need to see the arm. Eli!" He didn't fight her. He just nodded, his eyes closed. She cut away the sleeve of his wool shirt. The bear gash was a ruin. The stitches had held, but the skin around them was angry, swollen, and a dark, purplish red. It was weeping, hot to the touch. Clara's stomach turned, but she forced the bile down. She had seen worse. In the back rooms of Madame Eve's, she knew what festering wounds meant. She took the small kettle, packed it with snow, and set it over the fire. When the water was scalding, she dipped a strip of her own chemise into it. She cleaned the wound. He hissed, a sharp intake of breath, his body going rigid, but he did not cry out. She cleaned it until it was raw, until the infection ran clear. She had nothing else. No medicine, no salve. She packed the wound with clean snow, a trick she'd heard an old trapper talk about, to draw the heat. Then she bandaged it tightly with the last of their clean cloth. He fell back, his breathing shallow. She fed him hot water, spoonful by spoonful. She risked her own hands, taking off her gloves to hunt for more wood, her fingers cracking in the cold. She sat guard all night, the rifle across her knees, watching him shiver and burn. They were trapped there for 2 days. The fever raged. He was no longer the stoic mountain man. He was a child, lost and in pain. He tossed, kicking off the furs, and she would cover him again. On the second night, the fever peaked. He was delirious, his eyes open but seeing a different world. He stared at the rock ceiling, his hands clutching the blanket. "I tried," he mumbled, his voice hoarse-sided. "I told him not to go. The papers don't matter. Josiah, they don't care." Clara sat beside him, wiping his face with a damp cloth. Josiah? His brother, the preacher. His breathing hitched. "The fire! It's so hot! I can't get to her! The roof!" He grew agitated, trying to sit up. "Rose! Rose! Don't go in there! The fire! Rose!" His voice broke on the name, a sound of such profound, bottomless grief that it pierced Clara's heart. She put her hands on his shoulders, gently pushing him back down. "Shh, Eli, it's all right. I'm here." He focused on her, his eyes wild. He didn't see Clara. He saw someone else. "Rose," he whispered. "You came back. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I loved him, but He collapsed back, the brief surge of energy gone, leaving him limp. Clara sat in the darkness, the small fire casting leaping shadows. Rose. She finally understood. It wasn't just his brother he had lost. It was his brother's wife, the woman he loved, the gravestone under the pine, marked only with a branch. It wasn't for his brother. It was for her, or for the memory of her. He had lost everything. She slid under the furs with him. This was not about desire. It was about survival. He was a furnace, radiating a dangerous heat, but she was freezing, and he needed an anchor. She wrapped her body around his, holding him, her head on his chest, listening to the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart. She held him, not as a lover, but as a witness. She held him while he mourned a woman he had never allowed himself to claim. She did not sleep. She held him until the first gray light of dawn. Just before morning, his shaking stopped. The heat that had poured from him subsided. He was still, and his breathing, for the first time in days, was deep and even. He was covered in sweat, but the fever had broken. He woke. His eyes were clear. He was weak, exhausted, but he was himself. He looked at her, her face inches from his, her hair a tangled mess, her arms still wrapped around him. He saw the understanding in her eyes. He knew, somehow, what he had said. He said nothing. He just tightened his arm around her, a gesture of gratitude, of shared history. And they slept, truly slept, for the first time since the cabin burned. 2 days later, another storm bore down on them. The sky turned a bruised, greenish black, and the wind returned, this time with ice. "We need shelter," Eli said. His voice was still weak, but the iron was back. "A real one." They pushed the horse hard, and just as the first pellets of ice began to strike, they found it. It was a ruin, the skeleton of a small church. The steeple had collapsed, and half the roof was gone, but 4 walls still stood. They led the horse inside, the animal whinnying nervously as its hooves echoed on the broken floorboards. Snow had drifted in, covering the overturned pews. Eli set about securing the horse in a corner while Clara tried to build a small fire in the lee of what was left of the altar. She found a pile of dry, rotted wood and got a small, sputtering flame going. The place was desolate, haunted. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls. Clara, exploring for more wood, found a dark, charred shape in the corner. It was a book. She pulled it from the debris. It was a Bible, its cover burned, its pages fused together by water and fire. She stood, holding the ruined book, and a cold, bitter feeling rose in her chest. All her life, she had heard of God. In the orphanage, they had spoken of his mercy. In the brothel, the men had cursed his name in pleasure. She thought of the cold, of the bounty hunter, of Sarah, the girl she had left behind, of Madame Eve, of this broken, empty house of God. She spoke, her voice quiet, but it carried in the empty space. "I wonder if he ever truly sees people like us, people who live in the dirt, or if he just looks away." Eli had come up behind her, his steps silent. He was leaning against a broken pew, his face gaunt from the fever. He looked at the burned Bible in her hands. He was quiet for a long time. "He saw you," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, confused. "He saw you," he repeated. "Enough to send you to me." Clara stared at him. It was the truest, most profound thing anyone had ever said to her. She had been a curse. She had been trouble. He saw her as a deliverance. She let the book fall from her hands. They stayed in the church for one night. The storm passed. They ate the last of their food. Black Hollow was close now. Maybe 2 days. They rode out of the foothills and onto the flat, muddy plain that led to the town. The air was warmer here, the snow turning to gray slush. "They'll be looking for me," Clara said. A woman with the long brown hair. She stopped him. "Give me your knife." He handed it to her without question. She grabbed a fistful of her own hair, the long, tangled strands that fell to her waist. She sawed at it, the blade dull against the thick locks. It was a brutal, hacking motion. She cut it short, ragged, until it was no longer than a man's, sticking up in uneven tufts. She looked at the hanks of hair in her hand, then let them fall into the mud. She felt lighter, she felt uglier, she felt safer. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable. He took the knife back. Black Hollow was not a town. It was a wound, a collection of raw lumber buildings, leaning against each other in the mud, centered around the railroad depot and a half-dozen saloons. It smelled of coal smoke, wet horses, and despair. They rode in at dusk, avoiding the main street. Eli kept the horse in the alleys, his eyes sharp. Clara pulled her hat down low, her short hair tucked underneath. Eli dismounted at a small, poorly lit mercantile. "Stay here," he ordered. He went inside. Clara waited, her heart pounding. Every man who passed looked like the bounty hunter. Every shout from a saloon made her jump. He came out. He was carrying a small sack, and something else. He walked up to her, and his eyes softened. He held out his hand. In it was a scarf. It was not fine wool, but cheap, dyed cotton, a bright, impossible shade of blue. "To cover your hair," he said, his voice low. "And the cold is still sharp." She took it, her fingers, chapped and raw, brushed his. She wrapped the scarf around her head, covering her jagged hair, tying it under her chin. The blue was shocking against her pale, dirty skin. It was the first beautiful thing she had owned in her life. He reached up, his thumb brushing her cheek, a gesture of such simple affection it almost broke her. "It suits you," he said. They found a livery, sold the horse for cash, and bought food. They would need the money. They rented a small, cold room above the feed store, paying for one night. They were shadows, moving through a town that wanted her dead. That night they planned. "I need to get in," Clara said. "I need to find Sarah." "We go in," Eli corrected. "You know the way. I'll watch the door." "It's not that simple. There are men, the partner, he's always there. And the madam, she sees everything." "I'll be there," he said. It was a promise. They waited until after midnight. The piano music at Madame Eve's had quieted, the shouts turning to low, drunken mumbles. They moved through the back alleys, thick with refuse and frozen mud. Clara's stomach was a knot of ice. She was back. The smell of cheap perfume and stale beer hit her, and she gagged. "I can't," she whispered, her hand on the back door. Eli's hand covered hers. His warmth sank into her. "Yes, you can. I'm right here. I'm not leaving." She took a breath and pushed the door open. It led to the kitchen. It was empty, a single lantern burning low. "The girls' rooms are upstairs," she whispered. "Sarah's was at the end of the hall." They crept up the back stairs. The house was asleep, but it was a restless, heavy sleep. They heard a man snoring, a woman's quiet sob from behind a closed door. Clara's past rose up, choking her. She found the room. The door was unlocked. She slipped inside. Eli stood guard in the hall, a shadow among shadows, his rifle held low. A small shape huddled on the cot. It was Sarah. She was thinner, paler. "Sarah," Clara whispered. The girl gasped, sitting bolt upright. "Clara, they said you was dead." "I'm not, Sarah. I need your help. You have to tell me what you saw. The night Barlow died. The truth." Sarah was shaking, her eyes darting to the door. "He'll hear the partner, Mr. Sykes. He's always—" "He won't," Clara promised. "I'm not alone. Tell me." "It was her," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Madam Eve, it was her, Barlow. He was blackmailing her, said he knew about what she did to the girls who got sick. He was gonna tell the law. He wanted money. And she killed him." She tried to reason with him. He laughed. He called her a name. And she stabbed him with the little silver knife she keeps in her garter. I saw it. I was hiding in the pantry. Then she saw you, and she screamed. She called for Mr. Sykes, and they—" The hall floorboard creaked. Eli's voice was a low growl. "Clara, we've got company." The door flew open. It was not Eli. It was the man, Sykes, a large, bald man with dead eyes. He filled the doorway, a shotgun in his hands. Well, he said, his voice a wet rattle. "Look what the cat dragged back in." He grabbed Clara by her arm, yanking her out of the room. "The madam will be very pleased to see you." "Eli!" Clara screamed. Eli was there. He lunged from the shadows, but two more men, hired guns, appeared from the other end of the hall. They leveled their pistols. "Drop it, mountain man," Sykes snarled, "or she gets it now." Eli froze, his rifle in his hands. He looked at Clara, his face a mask of cold fury. Slowly, he lowered the rifle. They dragged Clara down the main staircase, her feet barely touching the steps. Sykes threw her onto the parlor floor. The room was lit by a dozen lamps. Madame Eve sat in a red velvet armchair, a glass of brandy in her hand. She was dressed in silk, her hair perfectly coiled. She looked as if she were waiting for them. She looked down at Clara, at her ragged hair, her dirty clothes, her defiant, terrified eyes. She smiled, a slow, cold smile. "So, you came home, my dear," the madam said, her voice smooth. "And you brought a friend. How lovely." She took a sip of brandy. "You've caused me a great deal of trouble, but this is a perfect ending." She nodded at Sykes. "Kill the man. Put the girl back to work. She has a debt to pay." Sykes grinned and raised his shotgun at Eli, who stood at the top of the stairs. Clara looked at the madam. "You did it," Clara choked out, pushing herself up. "You killed him. Sarah saw you." The madam's smile faltered for just a second. "The girl sees what I tell her to see." She looked at Clara's scarf. "You poor stupid child. You run off, find some filthy mountain man. And you think he makes you clean? You think anything can make you clean?" The words hit Clara harder than any blow. All her shame, all her fear, came crashing back. "No," Clara whispered. "No, what?" the madam mocked. "No," Clara said, her voice rising. She stood up. The fear was still there, but the rage was bigger. "You don't get to say that. You don't get to touch him." "Kill him," the madam ordered, her voice sharp. "Eli, run!" Clara screamed. Eli did not run. He dove sideways, off the stairs, crashing onto a card table below. Just as the shotgun boomed, the blast obliterated the wall where he had been standing. The parlor exploded into chaos. Sykes roared, trying to reload. The other two men fired their pistols. Eli rose from the wreckage of the table, his rifle already at his shoulder. He did not fire. He was a force of nature. He brought the rifle butt around in a vicious arc, cracking one man across the jaw. He slammed the barrel into the stomach of the second, doubling him over. Sykes leveled the shotgun again. At that moment, Sarah, who had followed them down, screamed at the top of her lungs, "Fire! Fire! Murder!" She threw open the front doors, screaming into the street. The sound of a whistle shrieked outside. "What is this?" the madam hissed, standing up. The front doors burst open. It was not a customer. It was the town sheriff, a gray-bearded man with a star on his chest, his pistol drawn. Behind him were 2 deputies. He must have been patrolling, drawn by the shotgun blast and the screams. The room froze. Eli with his rifle on the 2 groaning men, Sykes with his shotgun, the sheriff with his pistol. "Drop 'em," the sheriff ordered, his voice like gravel. "All of you." "Thank God, Sheriff," Madam Eve said, her composure snapping back. This animal, he broke into my house. He attacked my guests." "He's lying," Sarah shrieked from the doorway. "She's the murderer. She killed Mr. Barlow. I saw her. She stabbed him with her little knife." The sheriff looked at the madam. Her face had gone chalk white. He looked at Sykes. He looked at Eli, who still hadn't lowered his rifle. "I said, drop it," the sheriff said to Eli. "He drops it first," Eli growled, nodding at Sykes. Sykes hesitated, then let the shotgun clatter to the floor. Eli lowered his rifle. "Ma'am," the sheriff said to Madam Eve, "I think you and I need to have a talk. Downtown, you too," he said to Sykes. "And you too." He motioned to the other men. As the deputies put cuffs on the madam, her mask of civility shattered. She lunged at Clara, her face a knot of pure hatred. You ungrateful whore! I'll see you hang for this!" Eli stepped in front of Clara, his body a solid wall, and took the force of the woman's rage until a deputy pulled her away. The parlor was suddenly quiet. It was over. A woman stepped in from the street, drawn by the commotion. She was dressed in plain gray, her hair pulled back. She looked at Sarah, who was sobbing in the doorway. "Child," the woman said, her voice firm but kind. "Come with me. You're safe now. I'm Mrs. Gable. I run the shelter at the Presbyterian Church." She wrapped a shawl around Sarah and led her away. Clara stood in the middle of the ruined parlor, shaking. Eli put his hand on her shoulder. The sheriff looked at them. He was weary. He looked at Clara's face, her short hair, her blue scarf. He looked at Eli, a mountain man who was clearly out of his element, but just as clearly dangerous. "You too," the sheriff sighed. "You'd better come with me, too. We need to get your story, and I suggest it be the truth." The sheriff's office was small, hot, and smelled of stale cigar smoke and dust. It had taken 2 days. 2 days of questions, of Clara telling her story over and over, her voice growing thin and brittle. Sarah, small and terrified, had told hers, her whisper barely audible. Sheriff Brody was a man worn smooth by hard territory. He listened. He looked at Madam Eve, who spat poison, and at Sykes, who said nothing. He looked at the other girls from the house, who, now that the madam's power was broken, spoke of Barlow's blackmail and the madam's silver knife. On the 3rd morning, he brought Clara into his office. Eli stood by the door, his presence a silent, heavy weight in the small room. "It's done, miss," Brody said, not looking at her, his eyes on the paperwork. "Your name is cleared of the murder, with Sarah's testimony and the others. We'll see her tried. Sykes, too. They'll hang, or spend the rest of their lives in the prison at Deer Lodge." Clara waited. She had expected to feel light. She had expected relief or joy. She felt nothing. She was just tired. The wound, the one deep inside her, had not closed. "But?" she asked. The sheriff finally looked up. His eyes were sympathetic, and that was almost worse. "But this town is not your home. You're cleared of the murder, girl, but you ain't clear of what you are." Clara flinched. Eli took a step forward, his hand clenching. But she put a hand out, stopping him. "The good women of Black Hollow," Brody continued, gesturing to the street. "They don't like reminders. And Madame Eve had friends, Barlow had family, powerful ones. All they see is a whore and a mountain man who killed a bounty hunter. Even if the kill was righteous, it's blood." He stood, putting on his hat. "I'm giving you advice. You're free to go. So go, ride west. Don't come back. Trouble found you here, and it'll find you again if you stay." They left the office. The sun was bright. The town was alive. But as Clara walked, the women on the boardwalk crossed the muddy street. The men, the ones who had been customers, either sneered or looked away, ashamed to be seen. The stain was real. She was clean, but she would never be clean. Eli took her arm. He bought back his horse and a mule with the money he had left. He bought flour, salt, ammunition, and beans. Within an hour, they were riding out of Black Hollow, this time heading west, into the wind. They rode for weeks. They left the broken, muddy plains of Montana and entered the high, empty country of the Wyoming border. The land was vast, an ocean of sagebrush and grass that rolled toward the mountains. They had no destination. They were just moving. One evening, they made camp by a small river. The water clear and cold. The sun was afire on the horizon. Clara had been silent for 2 days. "Where are we going, Eli?" she asked the fire. He was sharpening his knife, the sound a steady scrape of steel on stone. "Away," he answered. "Away isn't a place." He stopped. "It's far from them." She pulled her knees to her chest. "When I was in that house, I used to dream. I wasn't allowed to read, but I saw pictures in magazines. Pictures of houses, clean houses, with white curtains." She looked at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face in the firelight. "I dreamed I had a house, a big kitchen, maybe I could take in boarders, sewing, cooking, a real trade, and there would be room for girls like Sarah, girls who have nowhere to go. I could teach them to read, teach them numbers, so they have a choice, so they don't have to be—" She trailed off, the shame rising again. Eli looked at his hands. They were scarred, calloused, one of them marked by the teeth of the bounty hunter. They were hands made for holding an axe, a rifle, a builder's hands. "It's a good dream," he said, his voice quiet. "You find the spot. I'll build the house. I'll build whatever you need." She looked at him, startled. He was not just offering comfort. He was offering a life. He was offering to build her dream with his own 2 hands. They found the cabin a week later. It was tucked into a high valley, where a creek ran down from the snowpack. It was old, built by trappers decades ago, and abandoned. The roof was sound, the stone chimney solid. It was one room, with a sleeping loft, and a small, collapsed corral out back. It was a home, or it could be. The work began. It was a new kind of survival. This was not about running. It was about staying. Eli was a man remade. The haunted stillness of the mountain solitude was replaced by a fierce, driving purpose. He spent his days with his axe, the sound echoing through the valley as he felled trees. He rebuilt the corral, his movements sure and strong. He re-chinked the logs of the cabin, sealing it against the coming winter. He hunted, and they had fresh meat. He dug a patch of earth near the creek, turning the soil, and she planted the small sack of beans and potatoes he had bought. Clara, too, was building. She scrubbed the cabin until the floorboards were pale. She aired the dust and mouse smell out of the small loft. She took the mule into the nearest settlement, a dusty junction with a trading post, a full day's ride. Eli had traded the pelts he'd gathered on the journey, with the money. Clara did not buy a new dress. She bought bolts of cotton, bright reds and blues and yellows. She bought needles and thread and flour and salt. She sat in the doorway in the evenings, sewing. She was making quilts, patchwork, Her stitches were small and tight. As she worked, she would hum. The sound was still fragile, but it was no longer frightened. Their life, which had been forged in ice and fire, now settled. It became grounded. The passion was still there, but it was no longer a desperate, hungry thing. It was deep. It was quiet. It was sure. Summer came, hot and dry. The creek was their life. One afternoon, the air thick with heat, they went down to the water. He took his rifle, laying it on the bank, always watchful. She unbuttoned her dress, the one she had sewn from rough canvas, and waded in, the cold water a shock. He followed, stripping off his shirt, the burn scars on his back pale against his tanned skin. She washed her hair, and he took the soap, his rough hands working the lather. His touch was no longer hesitant, but it was still gentle. He washed her back, his thumbs pressing into the muscles of her shoulders, easing the ache of the long days. She turned and did the same for him, her small hands scrubbing the dirt and sweat from his skin. It was a simple act, as domestic as washing dishes, and more intimate than any night of passion they had shared. Their moments were stolen. Simple? One day, while checking the garden, she laughed, a full, easy sound, at the way a rabbit had nibbled one of their potato plants clean. He pulled her down into the tall, sweet grass, and their kiss was long and slow and tasted of sunshine. A prairie storm rolled in one night, the sky cracking open, the air electric. The rain hammered the roof of the small cabin. They were in the loft, the world reduced to the sound of the wind and the flashes of lightning that lit the room. They made love, not with the desperation of their first encounter, but with the deep, powerful rhythm of the storm itself. It was a claiming, a celebration of the life they were building, a defiant act against the ghosts that had hunted them. They were, for a time, at peace. The peace shattered on a hot day in late August. A rider came through, a mail carrier on a circuit, following the creek line. He saw their smoke, a rare sign of life in the valley. He had a bag of letters, forwarded from the settlements. "Got one," he said, squinting at a worn envelope. "For a Clara," came by way of Black Hollow. Clara's hands trembled as she took it. The postmark was 2 months old. It was from Mrs. Gable, the woman who ran the church shelter. She opened it. Eli watched her face. He saw the color drain from it. He saw her hand go to her mouth. "What is it?" "She's gone," Clara whispered, the letter shaking. Sarah, she ran away. 3 weeks after we left." She read the words, her voice breaking. "Mrs. Gable says she was restless. She wouldn't talk to anyone. Then she just disappeared. She thinks she fell in with a man, a gambler, heading for the rail camps up on the Laramie line. She thought Sarah might try to find me. She said you were the only one she ever trusted." Clara sank to the cabin floor, the letter crushed in her fist. I left her. I saved myself, and I left her in that town. And I... The guilt crashed down on her, suffocating, absolute. All the peace of the last months, the clean house, the warm bed, the love she felt for Eli. It all turned to ash. She was a curse. She had failed the one person who had saved her. Sarah had given the testimony that cleared her name, and she had left her behind. "Clara," Eli knelt in front of her. "Don't!" she sobbed, pushing him away. "You don't understand. I told her I would help her. I ran. Again. I just ran." Eli did not say it was not her fault. He knew, in her heart, it was. He stood. He took his rifle from the wall. He picked up his hat. He kicked the door open. "The rail camps," he said, his voice flat. "Where are they?" It took them 4 days of hard riding. The rail camps were a fresh scar on the face of the prairie. A long, muddy track of tents, makeshift saloons, and canvas brothels had sprung up to serve the hundreds of men laying the new line. It was a place of noise, and mud, and raw, dangerous energy. Eli and Clara rode in, their faces grim. This was a worse place than Black Hollow. This was a town with no laws, only appetite. They walked the muddy track, past gambling dens and whiskey tents. Clara felt the old, familiar sickness rise in her. Men looked at her, their eyes hungry. Eli's presence, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, was the only thing that kept them at bay. They found the saloon. It was the biggest tent, the Golden Spike. Inside, it was a wall of noise, a tinny piano, shouting, the clack of chips. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of stale beer. A small, crude stage was set up at the far end, and on it, she saw her. It was Sarah, but it was not. The girl's hair was dyed a harsh, brassy red. Her face was painted, a grotesque mask of powder and rouge. She wore a cheap, dirty red dress, the feathers on it matted. She was dancing, a clumsy, shuffling movement, while men hooted and threw coins. A man stood beside the stage, collecting the money in his hat. He was thin, with a narrow face and a silk vest. He smiled as Sarah danced. Clara saw red. The world narrowed to that man. She did not see the crowd. She did not see Eli. She saw Madame Eve. She saw Sykes. She saw Barlow. She saw every man who had ever hurt her, every man who had ever taken... She started walking. Eli saw the look on her face and moved with her. "Clara," Sarah whispered, her dance faltering as she saw her. "What?" "Get down from there," Clara ordered. The man in the vest, Silas Croft, stepped in front of her. "Who the hell are you, lady? The girl's working. Piss off." "I'm taking her home," Clara said, her voice a low, dangerous snarl. Croft laughed. "She ain't got a home, 'cept the one I give her. She owes me. Now, get out before you get—" He made the mistake of grabbing her arm. Clara snapped. The years of pain, of shame, of biting her tongue, of running, it all coalesced into one singular, violent moment. She was not a victim. She was a blade. She pulled the skinning knife from the sheath on her belt. She had carried it ever since the bounty hunter. She lunged, the knife aimed at his soft stomach. "I will kill you," she hissed, the words torn from her throat. She would have, too. She would have gutted him on the sawdust floor. But a hand, an iron band, wrapped around her waist, yanking her backward. Eli, he had moved faster than she could see. He didn't grab the man. He grabbed her. He locked his arms around her, pinning her arms, pulling her tight against his chest. The knife flashed, cutting only the stale, smoky air. Clara screamed, fighting him, a wild, cornered animal. "Let me go! He's... Let me kill him!" She was sobbing, hysterical, lost in her own rage. Croft scrambled back, his face white, tripping over a chair. The saloon had gone quiet. Eli held her. He did not let go. He held her as she fought, as she wept, as she tried to tear herself free. He buried his face in her ragged hair, his voice low and fierce, speaking for her ears only, cutting through her red haze. "You can't save her," he growled, his voice shaking with the effort of holding her. "You can't save her by becoming what they think we are." The words struck her. What they think we are. A killer, a whore, trouble. The fight went out of her. It vanished, leaving her utterly empty. The knife clattered from her numb fingers onto the floor. She stopped struggling and just broke. She turned in his arms, her body collapsing against his, and she wept. She buried her face in his worn shirt and broke down, the sobs tearing at her, a sound of such profound agony that the saloon men, hard as they were, looked away. She wept for Sarah. She wept for the girl she had been. She wept for the killer she had almost become. Eli just held her, his arms a fortress, his body shielding her from the stairs. He looked over her head, his eyes cold as the high mountain ice, locking on Silas Croft. "The girl," Eli said, his voice quiet, but it cut through the room. "She comes with us." Croft, pale and shaking, looked at the knife on the floor. He looked at the mountain man who held the sobbing, wild woman. He looked at the pistol on Eli's hip. "Fine," Croft stammered. "Take her. She's more trouble than she's worth." Eli did not take his eyes off the man. He bent, never releasing his hold on Clara, and picked up the knife, sliding it back into its sheath. He eased his grip on Clara, his hand moving to her back, steadying her. He looked at Sarah, who was frozen on the stage, tears cutting clean tracks through her face paint. "Come on, Sarah," Eli said, his voice gentle now. "We're going home." He put his arm around Clara's waist, holding her up. He took her hand. Then he held out his other hand to the stage. Sarah, shaking, stumbled down and took it. Eli Mercer walked out of the Golden Spike Saloon, out of the noise and the filth, leading his two broken women back into the clean, hard light of the prairie. The journey back from the rail camp was a silent one. Sarah was a ghost, huddled on the mule, her small body wrapped in Eli's spare blanket. She was scrubbed clean, the cheap paint and dye gone, but the emptiness in her eyes was a stain that soap and water could not touch. She was a hollowed-out thing, brittle as dry grass. Clara rode beside her, her own body aching. The explosion in the saloon, the red-hot rage that had driven her to nearly take a man's life, had drained her. She had looked into the abyss, and the face that stared back had been as ugly as any she had ever feared. She was terrified of it. She was terrified of herself. Eli rode in front, his back a solid, steady presence. He had not spoken of what happened. He had simply held her until the shaking stopped, picked up the knife, and lifted Sarah onto the mule. He had led them out of that hellish camp, and he did not look back. When they reached the small cabin in the high valley, it felt like a miracle. The air was clean, the creek was singing, and the new-built corral was sturdy. It was a place of order, a place of peace. Sarah did not seem to see it. She slid from the mule and walked to the stone hearth, sinking to the floor. She sat, her knees drawn to her chest, and stared at the cold, empty fireplace. She did not speak. She did not move. Clara brought her a blanket. Sarah did not take it. Clara laid it over her shoulders. The girl didn't flinch. That night, Clara set a bowl of stew beside her. In the morning, it was untouched, cold. Clara felt the old guilt, sharp as a fishhook. "I failed her," she whispered to Eli in the darkness of the loft. "I left her, and now I've broken her." "She ain't broken," Eli's voice rumbled beside her. "She's just lost. You were lost too, remember?" He was right. She had been that animal, scrambling backward on the cabin floor, waiting for the blow. The next day, Clara took a new path. She did not coddle. She did not plead. She sat on the floor a few feet from Sarah and began to sew. She mended the tear in Sarah's dress, the one from the saloon. Her stitches were small, even, and strong. She talked. She did not ask questions. She just talked. She told Sarah about the mountain, about the bear, about the way the snow felt in the high passes. She told her about the burned-out church, and the blue scarf, and the smell of the pine trees after a rain. She filled the silence with the small, real things of their new life. Eli worked, too. He took his axe and went to the woodpile. The steady thwack of the steel on wood, a heartbeat for the valley. He was building a fence, a long one, running from the corral to the creek. He brought in a rabbit for dinner and set it on the table. He stopped, looking at Sarah. She was watching him, her eyes wide with fear. He was the man who had held Clara back, a man of terrifying strength. She flinched as he walked toward her. He did not stop. He knelt in front of her, his knees cracking. He was holding something in his big, calloused hand. He held it out. Sarah stared. It was a bird, carved from a piece of soft pine. It was small, its wings half spread. She did not take it. Eli just set it on the floor in front of her, between her feet. Then he stood and went back to skinning the rabbit. Sarah stared at the small, wooden bird for an hour. Slowly, her hand, thin and chapped, crept out from under the blanket. Her fingers brushed the wood. She touched it. Then, in a swift, bird-like motion, she snatched it up and hid it in her pocket. It was a start. The rhythm of healing began. It was slow as the turning of the seasons. It was a life built of small, patient acts. Clara knew what Sarah needed. She needed what she herself had been denied: a choice, a future. Eli had made a trip to the trading post. He had come back with a mule load of supplies and one small, precious book, a primer. Clara sat with Sarah by the fire. "I'm going to teach you," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm going to teach you to read." Sarah looked at her, her eyes blank. Clara opened the book. The pages were stiff. "A," she said, pointing. "A is for apple." She did this every day. For an hour, she read the primer aloud, pointing to the words. B is for bear. C is for cat. Sarah just listened, her expression unchanging, the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. After a week, Clara was on the letter M. M is for mountain. A small, dry croak came from Sarah. "What? What's that one?" Clara froze. Sarah was pointing, her thin fingers shaking. "That's R," Clara said, her heart pounding. "R is for river." "River," Sarah whispered. The word was a puff of air. "Yes," Clara said, her voice thick. "River." The next day, Sarah sat a little closer. Eli took a different approach. He saw the girl was still trapped in her own head. She needed something for her hands, something real. He walked up to her, holding a length of sinew. "Come," he said. She looked at him, terrified, but she stood. She followed him out into the sharp, autumn air. He led her to a game trail, hidden in the aspen. He knelt. "Rabbit," he said, pointing to the tracks. "We need food. You set this. You eat, you don't, you go hungry." It was the hard law of the mountain, but it was not unkind. It was honest. He showed her how to make a snare, how to tie the slip knot. "You do it." Her small hands, which had been painted and used, were trembling. She fumbled with the sinew. It was a tangled mess. "Again," Eli said. She tried. She failed, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "I can't." "Again," he repeated, his voice patient, steady as the mountain itself. She tried again and again. On the fourth try, her fingers, remembering some old dexterity, tied the knot. It was small. It was perfect. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, holding the small loop of sinew. Eli nodded, a single, short dip of his chin. It was the most profound praise she had ever known. The next morning, she went with him to check the line. The snare was gone. She found it, dragged 20 yards. A fat snowshoe hare caught tight. She had brought meat to the table. When she walked back into the cabin, her head was, for the first time, held high. The story of their lives slowed into this new rhythm. Winter came, blanketing the valley in deep, silent white. The three of them were an island, a small bubble of warmth and light. Clara taught Sarah to read, and then to write. Sarah, it turned out, was hungry for it. She devoured the primer, and then the few books Eli owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare, a manual on animal husbandry, and his brother's Bible, the only thing he had taken when he fled Ohio. Eli taught Sarah to track, to mend leather, to shoot the small rifle. He taught her how to be self-sufficient, how to depend on no one but herself. And Clara healed. One morning, she was at the basin, the sun streaming through the one small window, melting the frost on the glass. She had washed her face and looked up. She saw her reflection. Her hair, which she had hacked off in the mud outside Black Hollow, had grown. It was soft, brown, and curling around her face. Her skin, once pale and bruised, was clear, tanned by the wind. Her eyes were not the eyes of the girl in the brothel. They were not the eyes of the terrified fugitive. They were just her eyes. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She did not see a whore. She did not see a murderer. She just saw Clara. She heard a sound from outside, a thwack of the axe, followed by a small, thin shriek of laughter. Sarah. Eli was teaching her to split wood. Clara smiled at her own reflection. Eli, in turn, had given himself over to this new life. The stoic, solitary man had vanished, replaced by a father, a partner. He had become a man who listened. He watched Clara. He saw the way she managed their small world, with a quiet strength that astounded him. She was the one who decided when to plant, who rationed the flour, who knew when Sarah was strong enough to hear a hard truth, and when she needed a soft word. He trusted her. He had trusted her with his life in the snow. Now he trusted her with his heart, with his home. He had let her take the lead, and she had led them into this quiet, steady peace. He looked at her, and he still felt that quiet awe, that feeling of watching something impossible and beautiful unfold. The deep cold of winter settled in. The nights were long. Sarah slept soundly in the loft, the sleep of a child who is, for the first time, truly safe. One night, the cabin was still. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes outside, muffling the world. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind in the chimney. Sarah was asleep. Eli sat by the hearth, oiling his rifle, the metal gleaming in the golden lantern light. Clara was mucking a blanket, her needle dipping in and out of the thick wool. "Eli," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped, his hand pausing on the rifle stock. "Aye." She set her sewing aside. She looked at him, not with the passion of their first nights, nor the desperation of the storm, but with a deep, calm love that was as solid as the log walls around them. "I've been thinking," she said. I don't need a preacher. I've seen what men's laws are. They're not for people like us. They're just words. They're twisted. They're used as weapons." He waited, watching her. "I don't need a piece of paper from a judge. I don't need a ring of gold." She took a breath. "But I need a promise. Not marriage, not yet, not something for the world, something for us. Promise me something real, something that doesn't vanish in fire or blood, something that holds." He looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the woman who had faced down a bear, who had survived a brothel, who had nearly killed a man for the sake of another, and who had just healed a broken child. He did not speak. He set the rifle carefully against the wall. He stood, walked to the small chest where he kept his tools and his few possessions. He took out a small, pale object. It was a piece of bone, from the buck he had killed that first autumn. He sat back down, in his chair, across from her. He took his skinning knife. For an hour, the only sound in the cabin was the scrape of steel on bone and the whisper of the snow outside. He worked slowly, his large, scarred hands moving with a delicate precision she had never seen. He was not a clumsy man. He was a patient one. He carved a ring. It was not perfect. It was not round. It was thick and strong and marked by his knife. It was real. When he was done, he took a thin, strong strip of leather sinew. He looped it through the bone ring. He knelt in front of her. He took her left hand. He did not put the ring on her finger. He wrapped the sinew around her wrist, the small, pale piece of bone resting against her pulse. His touch was warm. He finished the knot, pulling it tight. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the soft light. As long as I breathe, he said. The snows melted, the creek swelled. Spring came to the high valley, bursting forth in a riot of pale green aspen leaves and bright wildflowers. They had survived. They needed supplies. The quilts Clara and Sarah had sewn were piled high, beautiful works of color and warmth. The pelts from the winter's trapping were cured and bundled. We need to trade, Eli said. I'll go, Clara offered. We go together, he said. There was no argument in his voice. It was a statement. All of them. The nearest town was a day's ride, a small, dusty settlement that served the ranchers and homesteaders in the valleys. They did not ride. They hitched the mule to a small travois Eli had built, and they walked. They walked into town, Eli in the middle, his rifle slung on his back. Clara was on one side, Sarah on the other. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn from blue cotton. Sarah wore one of green. Their heads were high. Clara felt the old fear prickle. She looked at the people on the boardwalk, but this time, she reached out and took Eli's hand. He enclosed it in his grip solid. On his other side, Sarah, her eyes wide, looked at the town. She hesitated. Then, copying Clara, she slipped her small hand into Eli's other one. They walked as a line, a family. The whispers started. People stopped. They saw the giant, scarred mountain man. They saw the two women, and they saw Clara. A woman's past was a heavy thing, and it cast a long shadow. That's her, a woman muttered to her husband, pulling her child close. The one from Black Hollow. They say she got cleared, the man said. But you know what she was. Clara felt her hand tighten in Eli's. She wanted to pull away, to hide her face, to cover herself. A man stumbled out of the town's only saloon. He was thick-set, his face red with whiskey. He saw them, and a slow, ugly sneer spread across his face. He planted himself in their path. Well, he slurred, his eyes raking over Clara. Look what we got here. Heard you was cleared. But we all know what you are, don't we, darlin'? He spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the boardwalk, inches from her feet. Clara froze. The old ice, the old shame, washed over her. She was 13 again. She was in the parlor. She was filth. She instinctively pulled back, her eyes dropping to the ground. Eli did not let go of her hand. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his knife. He simply took one step forward, putting his body between Clara and the man. He was a mountain. He was an unmovable object. He spoke, his voice quiet, but it was clear, and it carried in the sudden silence of the street. She's my woman, he said, his eyes locked on the drunkard, and she's better than any of you. The man's sneer faltered. He looked into Eli's eyes. He saw no anger. He saw no threat. He saw only the simple, unbending truth. He saw a man who had buried his past, and would not, under any circumstances, allow anyone to touch his future. The drunkard withered. No offense, mister, he stammered. Just making talk. He shuffled backward, then turned and scurried back into the saloon. The street was silent. The whispers had stopped. Eli turned back to Clara. He did not smile. He just looked at her. He waited. She took a breath. The ice in her chest cracked. The shame that had lived in her stomach for a decade. It was gone. It had burned away, leaving only a clean, bright strength. She was not hiding. She would never hide again. She stood straight, her head high. She squeezed Eli's hand. She smiled at him. She turned her head, looking at Sarah. The girl had watched the entire thing, her eyes wide, her small face pale. She was looking at Clara with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. Clara, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with an emotion Clara couldn't name. I want to be like you someday. Clara looked at this girl, this child who was her reflection, her echo, her redemption. She felt a wave of love so fierce it ached in her chest. She reached out her free hand and touched Sarah's cheek. "Then be better," she said, her voice soft but unbreakable. "Be smarter, be stronger, be kinder." Clara turned her gaze from Sarah, back to the man who held her hand, the man who was her anchor. She looked up at his strong, weathered face. Her heart was so full she thought it might burst. It was not the desperate passion of the burning cabin. It was not the quiet peace of the summer grass. It was something bigger. It was real. It was earned. She looked at the town, at the curious, silent faces. She looked at the wide, open sky. And she knew for the first time, with a certainty that settled into the marrow of her bones, she was not trouble. She was not a curse. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you are listening from, so please leave a comment. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this, and share your thoughts with us in English.